Hey, welcome to the Investigative Journal. We're going to be with you for the next 2 hours. And let me tell you this, you can go to my website at arcticbeacon.com and get a lot of my shows from the years past as well as articles. And tonight my guest is attorney Jon Levy. And Jon is licensed in the States as well as licensed in England. And throughout Jon's career, he's taken on some extraordinary cases. And I've had the privilege to report on some of them. We're going to talk about a few of them tonight. And one that comes to mind is Alperin v. Vatican Bank. And Jon's been on my show for years talking about this. It's a case that, if you haven't heard about it, we're going to just spend a few minutes because the case has been going on for 10 years. And it discusses the Vatican's role in genocide during and after World War II in the Serbian-Croatian genocide. So I thought we'd start there and move on, Jon. Just give our listeners a little backdrop of what this case was all about and where it sits right now.
Yeah, well, hi, Greg. It's good to be back and talk to you about this case, which is still ongoing. The case has to do with money laundering by the Vatican Bank. And, of course, everyone's familiar with the Vatican Bank and its reputation for money laundering. But the type of money laundering that's involved here is loot from the Second World War in Yugoslavia, mainly from Serbian Orthodox Christians who were murdered by the fascist regime in Croatia, which was an ultra-Catholic regime directed from Rome. Also, Jews and Roma, gypsies, people also lost money, and there was by the end of the war there was a fantastic amount of gold from concentration camps there and other funds that were driven in a convoy down essentially in 1946 by fascists in British uniforms, kind of something right out of James Bond, and deposited at the Vatican Bank. In fact, the convoy drove right into St. Peter's Square after stopping at a Franciscan monastery in Rome, and we've got eyewitnesses to that. So we thought, well, hey, that's a slam dunk case to take to a federal court back in 1999 and get some restitution for the Holocaust victims.
Jon, who came to you to take on the case?
Well, it's interesting. The government of Ukraine asked us to take on the case as part of its efforts in Holocaust restitution, because remember, there were a lot of people who lost loved ones who were murdered during this Second World War, not just Jews. And these folks were looking at the restitution at that time that was mainly run by the Jewish organizations, and were saying, hey, we need to give everybody something. And unfortunately, they were unsuccessful in a large way. But this litigation was an outgrowth of that effort because, as I said, most of the victims were Orthodox Christians, which was a little bit different.
Give us a brief synopsis of how this slid down through the courts over the years.
Well, it worked its way through the federal courts in Northern California where it was filed, and eventually went up and down to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals a couple times and split into various cases. But by 2010, we were essentially very dismayed to be dismissed. The courts concluded after 10 years of this that they didn't really have jurisdiction over the Vatican, which is a pattern that's been, you see time and time again with others who have tried to sue the Vatican.
And how are you trying to establish jurisdiction over the Vatican?
Well, there's exceptions to immunity where there's a commercial transaction or where there's been commercial transactions in the United States. And, of course, everybody knows the Vatican Bank does business in the United States. But that apparently was not good enough for the courts. I mean, they dismissed that as fiction. They said, you can't prove the Vatican is in the gold business. Even when we submitted documents from the Federal Reserve Bank showing Vatican gold deposits at the New York Federal Reserve. There's lots of collateral evidence the Vatican is one of the largest holders of gold in the world. They have tiny little gold reserves. And our position is that if you steal gold if you have stolen gold in your vaults, gold is what they call fungible. You can't tell one piece of gold from the other, really. It gets commingled over 60 years. So our argument was, well, they're gold dealers, they're in the gold dealing business, and some of this victim gold obviously was, it's interchangeable. But they said, nah, get out of here, just showed us the door.
So the case was dismissed totally, or was one of the, if I remember right, one of the defendants is still involved in this, right?
Well, what happened was we decided not to go to the U.S. Supreme Court because it's just more of the same. The influence of the Vatican over the U.S. judiciary is immense. I mean, the majority of the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court claim to be practicing Catholics. So we weren't going to get very far there. However, as you know, the Vatican Bank's been involved in a lot of other money laundering scandals, in fact, some recently where they've gotten into some dust-ups with the Italian government. We don't get the full details on that, by the way, Greg, but there was a big case involving the Vatican Bank and J.P. Morgan accounts in Germany, and the Italian Treasury Police wanting to know where this very large sum of money was going. That gave me an idea, and I started looking. And the Vatican diplomacy is very cagey. That is, they never sign treaties. You'll see that the Vatican's an observer at the UN, but they're not a party to many of these treaties. But they issue euros. They're a member of the Eurozone. A lot of people don't know that. And to become a member of the Eurozone, the Vatican had to sign anti-money laundering treaties with the European Union.
What's the Eurozone?
Well, the Eurozone is that part of the European Union that uses the euro. So we're hearing a lot about it now, about the crisis in Greece, crisis in Portugal, crisis in Italy financially. Those are important because they're all part of the part of Europe that uses the euro as their currency. So it's known as the Eurozone, and it's dominated by the European Central Bank, which is dominated by German and French bankers. So the Vatican's part of that. They want to sell their souvenir euros at 10 times face value at the gift shop there. They got to comply supposedly with anti-money laundering laws. So we made a complaint. We took the whole case, took it over to Europe, made a complaint with the European Central Bank.
And what happened?
Well, predictably, the European Central Bank didn't respond. We wrote back. We got a letter finally from their attorney claiming some mix-up, and they said, we're not the right people. You go take that to the European Commission. Now, European Commission is the governing body of the European Union. So we took the case over to the European Commission. And we said, European Commissioner, who's the head of the commission, we've got some questions for you about the Vatican Bank. Number one, they're issuing gold euros. Where did that gold come from? Is that maybe that's concentration camp victim gold? We want an answer on that. And number two, we've got complaints about them laundering money from the Second World War that have never been answered. How do we go about getting an answer on that? So we got an answer to number one. They claim, of course, that, they buy their gold on the retail market. So they don't use any of their own gold to make these souvenir medallions and euros from. They allegedly buy it from a gold refinery. But on the second question, the European Commission told us, we think probably the Vatican is in violation of their treaty obligations, but they're going to fix it, you see. They're going to set up something called the Vatican Financial Authority as of January 2011. So you wait until they set that up in the Vatican City and go send your complaint over there. So
you get to run around in England, you get to run around here, right?
Yeah. So we took it to Vatican City, and what do you think happened? What do you think happened?
I guess they. I don't know what probably just decided to forget about it. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's right. That typical Vatican response, which is we didn't get one. So we wrote again a few months later. We didn't get a response. So we went back to the European Commission and said, okay, we waited for this. We waited for that. They're in violation of the treaty because they refused to respond to a complaint about the money laundering by the Vatican Bank, which is in Vatican City and is overseen by your Vatican Financial Authority. So they write back to me and said, oh, you know what? We've just discovered, Mr. Levy, or Dr. Levy, really, that you're not an appropriate person to be filing such a complaint. Yeah, you see here, you're not. They don't have to answer you. So I went, looked at the treaty, and it says attorneys are supposed to report suspicious activity involving transactions. And I'm an attorney, and I was reporting suspicious activity. So I took it back to the European Commission, and they changed their tune. They said, oh, wait a minute, Dr. Levy, we just discovered that the Vatican Bank is part of the Holy See. It's not part of Vatican City. In our treaties with Vatican City, right? So therefore you can go take a hike.
So that makes absolutely no sense, to be honest with you.
Well, it gets better. So I went through my files. You know, I got like 100,000 documents from the Vatican Bank litigation, and in there located an affidavit from the Vatican City's attorney, as well as who was also at the time the attorney for the Vatican Bank, a fellow by the name of Franzo Grande Stevens, who's one of the most powerful attorneys in Italy at the time. I think he's probably still alive. He was also general counsel for the Fiat Corporation. And in there, he's saying Vatican Bank is a creature of Vatican City, right? Mm-hmm. And we found other affidavits essentially stating the same thing. Well, as you know, the Vatican has many dualities to it, so you can be part of the Holy See in the Vatican City, and it makes sense because the Vatican Bank is one of the organizations located inside the confines of Vatican City. In fact, their only office is in Vatican City. Mm-hmm. So we wrote back to the European Commission and didn't get an answer. Wrote again, didn't get an answer. So we took the case to an organization, again, part of the European Union, called the European Ombudsman, and that's where the case is sitting now with a subdivision of the European Parliament. And of course, interestingly, the European Union bears a lot of resemblance to the Vatican organization-wise, with all these, triple redundancies. So
like
the case
patterned right after it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and as you know, the flag of the flag of the European Union, those stars. Of course, if you take a look at the crown of stars that's over the Virgin Mary's head, in a lot of the representations, it's the same stars. In exactly the same pattern.
Yeah, speaking of flags, it's interesting. If you look at the Vatican City, which is not, it's its own separate state within Rome, within Italy, then you have the City of London, which is not part of London proper, where all the banks are and Fleet Street and everything. And it's similar to Washington, D.C., which is not a part of the United States, correct? So they have their three little capitals carved out, and the flag of Washington, D.C. has 3 stars on it. And I believe those stars represent the Vatican, London, and America.
It's quite possible. Well, there's enough symbolism in all those places.
Right. Now, so basically, the case in America is done, right?
Yeah, no, we're not going to be going back to court in the U.S. I've learned my lesson on that the judiciary, the federal judiciary, and when it comes to matters of the Vatican and other things like that, you're not going to get a fair hearing. It's just not worth your time.
So they're basically protecting them. And what makes sense if they're protecting them is that if they have this bank able to do money laundering operations, wouldn't it make sense that people can throw their money in there and not feel free to do whatever they want with it, like rich politicians and rich bankers?
Well, that's correct. And of course, the thing about the Vatican Bank is it's not a bank in the sense that yes, it takes deposits, and yes, it probably has a few ATMs in Vatican City, and yeah, it handles the Vatican payroll and does some correspondent banking transactions. But you can also take a Picasso painting to the Vatican Bank. And the Vatican Bank's charter says it accepts all movable and immovable property as long as a portion of it is toward pious purposes, right? So if you're a pious person, like, say, remember Martin Frankel? He's serving a few more years to serve on his sentence. Had a big scam going with looting insurance companies. He set up a Catholic foundation. Of course, he was Jewish, but set up a Catholic foundation. And since he was going to give 10% to the Vatican Bank, that was for a pious purpose, right? So, but the key thing here is you can deposit artwork, you can deposit diamonds, jewelry, whatever, and the Vatican Bank will take it. They, of course, don't keep it there at the Vatican. They will put it in what's called they have secure facilities, I believe, in Switzerland, in Zurich, and a few other cities there. I think Lugano, over by the Italian border, where they have these warehouses, Greg, that are just filled with art treasures of the world. And people keep them there because those are in tax-free zones. And, of course, the Vatican has its portion of those warehouses.
And I guess they get a cut of that then, or something, don't they?
Well, you get, they'll take it for deposit, and then you work out some kind of arrangement with the Vatican Bank that, when you sell it, you're going to, pay a percentage.
Not bad. But let's say I wanted to put some money in the Vatican Bank. Could I go there and just say, hey, I'd like to deposit $100?
No.
Or open an account?
No, can't do that. But if you wanted to give $100 to the Franciscan order, you can send it to their account, and of course they could hold it for you. You see, this is the thing about the Vatican Bank. So there's accounts and sub accounts. So individuals can't do it unless you're a high ranking church member or member of the Italian Mafia.
Oh boy, how the world turns, huh?
Yeah, well, it is an important banking structure, as I found out. It's not the little small bank that they make themselves out to be.
Yeah, just with your experience, we got a few minutes here, maybe 6 before the break. We can get into some of the others, to maybe start on some of your other cases that you're working on. But, there's been an argument that some people say the Vatican really isn't as wealthy as some people who say they're the richest organization in the world. From your research over decades, where do you put them as far as the wealthy organizations of the world?
Well, they would have to be the wealthiest, Greg. Avro Manhattan, of course, did some work on that. But, the fact is, when you say the Vatican, the Vatican itself is very wealthy. If you count, I would count their art treasures, wouldn't you? They don't count them, by the way. Mm-hmm. But, when you count all the redundancies of Catholic organizations throughout the world and untaxed real estate and what they own, it is the most immense conglomeration of wealth ever known to mankind. Just think about what the real estate alone at Georgetown University is worth.
Exactly. Just think of the real estate in America, but take all the countries of the world they're in, which are most of them, right, and multiply that. No wonder politicians work with the Vatican in America.
Well, as I said, it's the wealthiest organization in the world, and money talks. And of course, they have a leg up on everyone because in most jurisdictions they're not taxed, and in some jurisdictions like Germany, a portion of the taxes go to them.
I never asked you this question, but besides Alpern v. Vatican Bank, have you ever taken them on in other places here in America?
I sued them over in England. I sued Pope Benedict on behalf of a organization, coincident with his visit to England back in 2010. And the case was initially accepted, but suddenly we got some very panicked messages from the court that the thing was being quashed before we could serve it on the Pope. And I can't get into it too much because there's ongoing litigation right now regarding it. But what had happened was apparently the United Kingdom Cabinet Office had a policy to stop legal threats to the Pope while he was in the country. And that's what we're litigating right now. We're trying to get to the bottom of that. They don't want to turn over their documents on it.
Right. So that's still around if you can get that heard, right?
Well, they pretty much quashed the case, and of course we had a chance to serve the Pope when he was right there in England. Now, of course, he's no longer there, so he can't snowballs chance in hell of serving the Pope. But we sued him as Ratzinger instead of as the Pope, and so they pretty much did a job on that lawsuit. But what we've got litigation on now is we want to get a hold of the incriminating documents from the UK cabinet that gave instructions to the courts what to do, how to pervert justice.
Mm-hmm. Hey, we got a few minutes before the break here, so just kind of give us a rundown of what we're going to talk about in the second half hour. Well, I know you have some cases in Africa.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work in Africa, and interestingly, it does tie into what we're talking about here somewhat with the Vatican. It ties a lot into oil and mineral resources. But in Africa is a place where the hand of the Vatican is also very strong. The Vatican is responsible directly for millions of deaths in Africa because of its stance on condoms, for example. They actively tell people in Africa, don't use condoms. And, of course, you have a massive spread of HIV over there, which has orphaned a lot of children. The other issue with the Vatican is in many of those countries, most of Africa, are, outside of North Africa, are Catholic countries. And of course, they provide now the bulk of the priesthood. And the grip of the Catholic Church in Africa is similar to what it was in South America 40 years ago.
All right, so we know what to expect because they'll probably play the same game there in Africa as they did in South America, don't you think?
Right. Yeah, things are maybe loosening up a bit in Latin America, but exactly. In one of the countries where I operate, Angola, for example, relatives of the president are high church members, so you have the same pattern repeating itself.
Right, so we're going to discuss a case from Angola that you're working on and one from Gabinda. Many people probably don't even know where that's at. And get into some of the nitty-gritty of those cases. One thing, we're going to do that in the second half hour. But one thing more that just came to my mind about the Vatican Bank cases. If, you've been working on this for 10 years, and if you kind of have not given up, but just said, hey, it's not worth it. I mean, the facts you give are so strong to show that they were involved in this genocide, and we have a court system that protects them. I think it's a perfect example of showing to the American people how our court system is really screwed. I mean, why even deal with people that are so dishonest if they're supposedly to give justice to all of us here in this country? What's your thoughts? Has it changed your mind about the veracity of our court system?
Well, the flaw, of course, is not in the court system or in the Constitution, but in the way that judges are appointed to those lifetime positions. Who puts them there? Mm-hmm. The President and Congress, that's who puts them there. And who gets those jobs? Well, essentially, people connected to donors. It's very. Some of them are perhaps true jurists, but the majority of them are skills of one sort or another.
All right, John, we'll be back in 3 minutes. Hey, welcome back to the Investigative Journal. We're here for the next hour and a half. I'm here every Sunday night on FirstAmendmentRadio.com from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., and that's Pacific time. You can also get my articles and radio shows that go way back on ArcticBeacon.com. Okay, John, we're going to talk about a couple more of these cases that you're working on. These involve human rights violations, perhaps land grabbing for wealth and minerals and oil. And where do you want to start out with? I know you're in Angola and also in Gabinda. It's up to you.
Right. Cabinda is an exclave of Angola. Actually, it used to be known as the Portuguese Congo, and we do some work in Cameroons. And
the Cameroons. Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Cameroons and with Biafra, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and other places in Africa. I'm working with an organization called the Organization of Emerging African States, OEAS. Someone wants to look it up. It's oeas.info on the internet, oeas.info. And the idea here is, of course, everybody knows Africa is just we know two things about Africa. You don't want to live there because it's in constant turmoil, And secondly, it's a very rich part of the world as far as resources. You know, we get a lot of oil out of there, especially the United States, getting oil from Nigeria and Angola. But it's also a lot of our most important components in our electronics come out of Africa. There's a mineral called coltan, columbium tantalum, which is just key to electronics, sort of like those rare earth metals out of China. Mm-hmm. So it's extremely important. Not too much is known about it, but the problems in Africa, of course, stem from the colonial boundaries that were drawn by the European colonial powers. And of course, it's interesting, all this idea that, people will go in there and draw boundaries regardless of, what the natural boundaries of the regions are and who lives there. That goes back to the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope, back in, the 16th century, Greg, decided he was going to divide the world between Spain and Portugal.
Exactly,
so it's the same kind of mentality. In this case, it was the Congress of Berlin in 1885 where the colonial powers got together and carved up Africa. So, of course, naturally, you have these artificial states that were created as the colonial powers pulled out, and you got two things. You got, bad governments, lots of resources, a few people getting wealthy, and, a lot of multinational companies coming in there getting rich. Unfortunately, it leaves a lot of unhappy people who don't want to be parts of those countries, which are generally dictatorships. So that's where I've been doing a lot of work with the groups that are trying to, peacefully, for the most part, secede from these countries and get their own nations back. These aren't made up countries. These are actually nations and peoples that have been previously acknowledged to exist, and they're trying to get back their self-determination. So I'm working with the Republic of Cabinda, which is a part of Angola, what they call an exclave that's surrounded by the two Congos, and that is where they produce about 500,000 barrels of oil per day there. Chevron does. And very little, if any, of that money goes to the people who live in Cabinda. So I'm working with them, and I'm also working with some folks called Southern Cameroonians. And Cameroon's a country there in West Africa, and it was divided between France and Britain after the First World War. And of course, the part of the country speaks English, and part of it speaks French, and the French part is the majority, and they have done their best to impose their French culture on the English speakers, which makes them very unhappy.
So here you have. So what are you trying to get accomplished in Cabinda?
Well, in Cabinda, they've been trying since they were independent in 1975, and they were invaded by the Angolans and Cubans because of the oil. Interestingly, it's a rare case where the Cuban government was working to protect Chevron, by the way, so that the Angolan government could continue to pump oil. So Cuban mercenaries were in there for about 10 years.
So here we have Cuba working together with Chevron in Africa, but we're still at odds with Cuba here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This was in the 70s and 80s when the Cubans were very active in Africa.
Oh,
and it had to do with oil. So the idea here is, the Cabindans want to get control of their oil. We're working on this legally through the court system in the African Union. And secondly, we just found a corporate sponsor, which is something we're seeing more and more of in Africa. With the death of Gaddafi in Libya, he was the last real ideological character there in Africa who would sponsor revolutionaries and groups. With him out of there, it's all private enterprise. So, if you want to stay in power in Africa or you want to get a new country, as in the case of South Sudan, you have to work with the corporations. So, you're going to work with oil companies, or you're going to work with the Chinese, or you're going to work with somebody where you're not going to get into power and you're not going to stay in power. So, the Cabindans, I've just worked with them to sign an agreement with the Canadian venture capital company, which is
what's the quality of life for the average Govindan?
Just dreadful. I mean, like I said, if they were independent, they would be the wealthiest country in Africa. They would be the Kuwait of Africa if they could keep their oil wealth there. Now, their unemployment is something like 60%. The schools are inadequate, and they're under military occupation by the Angolan army. So, and it's been that way for 30 years. It's a terrible situation. And we don't hear about it in the press here because it's in our interest, in the national interest of the United States, that oil keeps coming out of Angola.
And it seems like if all you hear here in America is about Africa is all these nonprofit agencies or the government saying, American people, donate your money to the poor Africans. Look how they're living. But here we got Chevron making a fortune over there, and they're good. You'd think we could get some justice and equality for the people there. I mean, it makes no sense.
Well, it's as we said before, it's similar to what South America used to be. So, of course, the United States propped up terrible regimes in South America if it suited the national interest. And, the same thing in Africa. I mean, these governments in Cameroon, which is a dictatorship, Angola, it's a dictatorship, they're democracies in the sense that Russia's a democracy, right? You have an election, but the outcome's foreordained. So, United States is big backers of these places. They just love these guys.
Mm-hmm. And what's your next step in this case?
Well, with corporate sponsorship for both these countries out of Canada, I mean, that may make a big change because we have other countries in Africa that are emerging. Over Somalia, of course, is another country. It's a mess, and it's another one of these artificial countries. There was never any entity called Somalia. That was something cooked up by the Italians that were in there. Somalia's got about 5 or 6 different parts to it that were formerly independent. So there's been oil companies working up and around the Horn of Africa in an area called Somaliland and Puntland, which are unrecognized governments, and they've done quite well. And the success story here, if you want to call it a success, is South Sudan, which is the newest country to be recognized by the United Nations. And, of course, millions of people dead there. But that's not why they became independent. They became independent because there's oil, and they worked out deals with the corporate sponsors to pump that oil and get it out of there.
All right, so you're working at, what's your latest case? We were talking about it before the show, but fill me in again and our listeners on what's the latest case you're working on. I think it's the Cameroons?
Well, yeah, both of those. I've got several cases out of Africa. I'm working on another one out of Nigeria regarding Boko Haram, which you may have heard of. Those are the Muslim terrorists that go around killing Christians in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. Nigeria, people think of it as a Christian country. It really isn't. It is half Muslim, and that is where Al-Qaeda has its strongest grip through this organization, Boko Haram, which firebombs churches. They just blew up another church last week. And it's interesting because I filed some cases with international tribunals on them. They appear to be actually an instrument of the government to terrorize the Christians from the region that produces oil.
Okay. And what's your outlook there?
Well, Nigeria is going to be Nigeria is really bad news. Anyone who follows that knows we get a lot of oil out of Nigeria, and Nigeria is certainly, the government's a mess. It's run by a fellow by the name of Goodluck Jonathan, and he's not particularly effective. It is where the most active, the most acts of terrorism in the world are committed in Nigeria, not the Middle East. And they're committed by radical Muslims, known as Boko Haram, who want to do nothing less than impose a Sharia state in northern Nigeria and kill all Christians who are there. And it's being used right now as sort of an instrument of terror by the government to keep the people from the southeast of Nigeria, it used to be called Biafra, that name should ring a bell, under control because, that's where the oil's located. However, my prediction is that Nigeria will not exist 5 years from now.
And what will happen?
Well, it's just going to devolve into its individual parts. But of course, the big fight will be over the part that has the oil, which used to be called Biafra. And those of us who are here in my age remember the civil war in Biafra in the 60s, where there was a genocide committed against the Biafrans by the Nigerians and the British, who blockaded the area. And what was that about? It was all about oil.
Yeah, again, and you said earlier the Vatican had its hands in the African scene. How have you seen that in working in these cases?
Well, the Vatican tends to be supportive of the governments that are in power. And, they never met an entrenched dictator they didn't like, is essentially how it works. You would think the church would be the ones speaking out against dictators, but not the Catholic Church. I mean, they love these guys because they're going to sign concordats with the church, and, they're going to, support the church in these countries.
So we have the Vatican, again, here in America, they love freedom, they say, but over there they appear to like dictators.
They do, and we notice that the churches, by the way, being bombed in Nigeria are not Catholic churches.
What are they? What type? Christian?
Probably, Christian Anglican churches or Protestant churches.
I always thought they worked, doing some research myself over the years, that they kind of worked behind the scenes using the cover of, being a priest to find out, specific information, passing it on to, people in the CIA, all the other operatives that work to prop up these dictators. And it's amazing that one of the things I've found over the years is amazing American people don't get it. What do you think keeps them in the pews here?
Well, I mean, they don't understand that the Vatican has its own separate worldview and foreign policy. I mean, look at all the terrorism that occurs in the world, and rarely is it directed at the Catholic Church, even though the Catholic Church is in all these places. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is it? Have they reached some accommodation with these people? And then the answer is probably yes.
Yeah, and they've reached an accommodation like we've seen in the last half hour with the judges here. And that should be the hardest place in the world when you think about it, because we're supposed to have the open, free democracy, the best judiciary system in the world. And if they can do it here, just imagine what they can do under the cover of a dictator.
Well, look, Greg, the church owns the judiciary in the U.S. 6 of 9, 5 or 6 of a majority of the U.S. Supreme Court judges are practicing Catholics. How did that happen?
Yeah, they got a lot of money. That's all. It's got to be that way, And I mean, can you imagine what goes on behind the scenes with these dictators in Africa? And we still have all the kill. It's just it's amazing. And I wonder. I'm looking at going back to the Cabinda case, okay, which I found an article here, and it mentions your name. And if I could read this, then maybe you could comment on what we may have missed. It says Jonathan Levy, attorney based in Washington, told the press there the deadline for submission of the merits of the case was February 20th, 2012. Now, you submitted those, right?
Yeah, that's the Cabinda case. That's right. We're taking on the Angolan government over the ownership of the oil resources.
All right, and then so Levy said that he's had 5 years to compile their case and was confident they would meet the 60-day deadline set in December. Was that passed, or is that this December?
Yeah, that was December. After we waited 5 years for the African Commission, which is a judicial group there in Africa from the African Union, to decide they were going to take jurisdiction over the case. So, unlike the U.S. courts, even the African courts will take jurisdiction over cases that are controversial. So they got one up on the U.S. federal courts there. But it took 5 years.
Okay, so everything is moving smoothly there. You've got your case. I was a little confused.
Yeah, our case is on file, and it's awaiting adjudication there, and it has to do with ownership of resources in Cabinda.
And basically, you're striving for independence.
That's right, and all these countries are. That's no secret, and they would be viable, and it would be good because, Africa doesn't need big countries with big armies because you get wars. I mean, if they were all relatively small countries that were, relatively homogenous and they got along, they wouldn't have a problem for big military expenditures. Of course, that makes some people who sell arms kind of unhappy.
Yeah, and you know what I see here? I mean, if you're striving to correct human rights, independence for a country, I would think that would be a great thing for Americans to get behind instead of sending over $10, which never gets to the people there, to get behind an independence movement, just like people, just like we became independent at one point in our history. If we want to really help these people, why don't we get behind them, get their voice heard? These people need their independence. They don't need $10 in their pocket, and they probably get $1 out of that.
Well, you probably even less. But here's the thing. Another way to think about it. The United States is a federal government, and it doesn't like to see other federal governments like South Africa or Nigeria or Brazil broken up. Mm-hmm. Because it said they were okay when the Soviet Union got busted up. But that, which also was a federal form of government, by the way. But in Yugoslavia, which was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, however, that trend has to stop. The United States says because we don't want any other federal organizations broken up. Because what's going to happen? Texas is going to secede, right?
I know. There's a lot of states want to get out now. Well, I think it'd be great. Yeah. Make it fun.
Well, and it's interesting. The Russian press right now is reporting this as big news.
Oh, that 50 states. They all sent. So there's a number of people from all of our states want to get out. Yeah.
Well, the feeling is the United States was instrumental in breaking up the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Turnabout is fair play, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh well. But anyway, so what do you look at this thing down the road? The chances of helping these people in Cabinda how do they look to you?
They look pretty good now that they've got a corporate partnership. Other corporations will follow. They don't like if they see one company stands to make billions of dollars, you'll see other companies there too. Because do the math, 500,000 barrels of oil a day. And that's just from the offshore. The onshore, no one even knows what's on there because it's a civil war zone. But 500,000 barrels at $100 a barrel. I don't know.
Where do these barrels go?
They go to the United States. It's called Cabinda crude, and a lot of it's exported to the U.S.
Oh, really? I mean, nobody hears about that one. But gas prices are still high.
Right. Well, gas prices are high. I hear that oil production in the U.S. is an all-time high, and oil prices are an all-time high. So it's interesting though. You look at natural gas prices, on the other hand, are an all-time low, depending where it's coming from.
Right. So here we have these people there starving, and these oil companies. How did they? How did they get in there? What gives them? What is the dictatorship allow these companies in? They sign an agreement? Is that how?
Oh, yeah, essentially in the case of Cabinda, they got in there under the Portuguese when they were in control of the area. And it used to be Gulf Oil, which became part of Chevron. And in the case of the Cameroons, it's the big companies like BP, Total, Egypt, and some of the other majors, Shell. They go in there, they have the money to, set up these offshore oil rigs and and start pumping.
A couple listeners always ask me. They said, "How do you get these cases?" Most attorneys are out chasing ambulances, things like that. How'd your career evolve? I think it'd be interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's not too many international lawyers who just kind of are set up on their own and therefore have the freedom to take whatever cases they want. They're with big law firms in London or New York or Washington or where have you. Now, I'm a little bit different. I'm self-taught. I started out as a criminal defense attorney, at the very bottom of the heap. And I thought, well, I need to improve myself. So I went back to school, got a PhD in political science, and started working from there in the international law field, just taking cases for free. So working my way up there, and now I take the cases that other people won't because it's too dangerous.
Exactly, and along the way you got your bar card in England too. Exactly.
Yeah, right? I did. So that's right. So the key here is if you're willing to take the cases that others won't, there is room for you, and people will come to you. And I've taken all kinds of cases, and I've taken a lot of heat about it. But it may sound kind of dangerous fooling around with African dictatorships, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. But believe me, that's nothing compared to dealing with the Vatican Bank. I've had clients literally turn, some of my Vatican Bank clients are literally in fear of their life, and with good reason. Dealing with the Vatican, I've had my life threatened, about 9 or 10 times now, at least. I've lost count.
And, talking about another case just came to my mind. You took on a case in Canada with a gentleman by the name of Rod Vinot and the Duplessis orphans. Why don't we finish up with that one? How's that going?
Yes, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm still representing Rod, and I know you've worked with Rod before. The Duplessis orphan case is one of the largest. It's a huge case involving thousands and thousands. A lot of them are dead now, unfortunately, of what were so-called orphans. Who aren't really orphans. There was a conspiracy in the 40s, 50s, and 60s between the government of Quebec, which was ultra-Catholic, the Catholic Church in Quebec, and the Canadian federal government to make money. And how they make money, they set up vast orphanages, institutions, work forms, and committed children to them, and then labeled them mentally retarded.
And these were Catholic orphanages as well.
They were all Catholic orphanages. They were all run by the Catholic Church, by various orders. And, there were medical experiments carried out as part of that, as part of MK Ultra. They sold babies around the world, and, they made tons of money. The government of Quebec did, and the Catholic Church. And they got remittances from the federal government. To look at it, they must have declared every 10th child in Quebec an orphan in order to make them a ward of the Catholic Church. And these orphans have never received much. There was some sort of fraudulent settlement back in the 90s where I think they got a couple $1,000s each, and just a few of them, and most of them were never compensated. In Canada, of course, we don't pay much attention to Canada, but Canada's had some terrible scandals also with the way they treated their native population there.
And where's the case stand right now?
Well, no Canadian attorney was, the way I got it, of course, was through you. You introduced Rod to me, and because no Canadian attorney would touch his case. And Rod, of course, is the leading spokesman for the Duplessis orphans. Duplessis was the Prime Minister of Quebec at the time.
Right. So is it at a standstill, or you got some hope to get some?
Well, yes. I can tell you right now that we filed a claim direct with the Vatican, and actually, believe it or not, they did acknowledge it, and acknowledged it twice, and it's under consideration, they say.
All right. Well, listen, John. Thanks a lot. We're all out of time, and.